set up.
Would it be all right if I sit back over in that
Yes, you
corner?
may.
I've got 25 minutes. Okay. I've got 25 minutes. And this is an opening statement, as the judge told you. It's not evidence. It's what I promise you the evidence will show. So you don't need my statement, opening statement, because it's not evidence. You don't need to take notes. You can do anything you want. But this is what I promise you the evidence in this case is going to show. And after we give the opening statements, you hear the evidence. And then you decide the case based on the evidence that you heard and the law that the judge gives you. And you put the two together and you give justice. That's the way justice is done. And I know I used to take notes, but when I took notes, I didn't hear as much. And since I have such a short time to try to explain to you in the opening statement what the trial is going to be about, it might be a good idea just to listen and hear sit back and let me tell you what really happened in this case. You can also hold me at the end of this case. You say, Mr. Feiger promised me that this is what he would prove in his opening statement, because I'm going to come back to you in the closing statement, and I'm going to sum up all the evidence that you heard during the course of the trial. And I make the promise to you today that what I am about to tell you, and the story that I am about to tell you about what happened in this case, I will prove and I will keep my word. So at the end of the case, you can say, Mr. Feiger kept his word to us. And what he said he would prove, he did prove. Now this case, as I indicated, the reason that we're standing here in a federal court in Wichita, Kansas is this is not a negligence case. This is a case under the Constitution of the United States. This is a case under the Constitution of the United States, specifically the 8th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And back in the 1800s, in the 1870s, Congress passed a law that said American citizens who were denied or whose constitutional rights were interfered with could come to court, could come to a federal court, and in front of a federal jury have justice done. So this is a process, and this is a law, and this is a right that has been going on now for well over 140 years. The redressing justice of constitutional rights. And so, in a very real sense, this case is about all Americans. It isn't just about Terry Bruner. It is about all Americans, because if they can do this to him, they can do it to anyone.
Counsel, is this argument or is this an overview of the evidence?
This is an overview of the evidence.
I don't think so. Move along.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, let me tell you in the time that we have what happened in this case and why we're here today. Terry Bruner was an American Creek Indian, 46 years old, I believe, at the time of his death. Here's his picture. And he was arrested and sentenced to jail, not prison, jail. Jail is for people who in this country are sentenced for very short, relatively short periods of time. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's 2 years, but it's never more than that in my experience. And jails are far different than prisons. And each county, or most counties in this country, have their own jails. And he was sentenced for DUI, drunk driving, and leaving the scene of an accident. And the sentence, I believe, was approximately, and I'm going to make mistakes in this case. I'm going to misremember names. I'm going to misremember dates. So I apologize in advance. I'm getting old and it's not perfect. So I forget certain things. I hope you'll forgive me of my sins. But it was approximately 10 months. He was incarcerated in jail here in Sedgwick County. However, as we've heard, and it's public knowledge, and nobody's going to deny this, they have an overcrowding problem in Sedgwick County. And that also translates into money, because it costs money to house people in jail. And it costs even more money if you send them to a hospital and care for them.
I hate to interfere, that's a bad thing to do, but I don't think this is relevant. I think it is relevant.
May I respond? It's not argument. This is relevant. It's the motive and the reason for what happened in this case. And this is an intentional case, intentional act, and it's certainly relevant as to why this happened and why it was done.
You're representing to the jury that you will prove that that's why these two defendants did not get medical care for the defendant. And if you want to make that representation to the jury, I think you do that advisedly.
Thank you. Cost money to obtain medical care. In the hospital, you'll find out. In Via Christi Hospital, if a jail sends a person who's in jail to the hospital, it's not free. Somebody has to pay the hospital. Everyone understands that. Cost is an issue. And we would be being naive, and you'll hear the facts in this case. Mr. Bruner was farmed out to another jail from Sedgwick County, another jail near the border of Colorado, Staton County. And he was housed there. Now, Mr. Bruner has a pre-existing medical condition that everyone knew about. He had cirrhosis of the liver and hepatitis C. Now, hepatitis C causes cirrhosis of the liver. Cirrhosis of the liver can be due to drinking, or it can be due to hepatitis C. It is a hardening, if you will, of his liver. And they all knew it. But why is that important in this case? Everyone knew it. It's all over his medical records. Because someone who has that pre-existing condition is more susceptible to illness than a person who doesn't have it. They're more susceptible. They can catch colds easier. They can catch viruses easier. They can catch bacterial illnesses easier. And if you don't take care of them, they can become much sicker. So if you house, and the Constitution requires, if you take in a person for drunk driving and house them in a jail, you are responsible, entirely responsible, for their well-being, for their health and their safety. The Constitution requires it. In fact, jailers have or take the position of, it's a Latin term, but it sounds exactly like it really is, in loco parentis.
Now we're getting instructions on law, Your Honor. I have
That is, I was just going to say something, Mr. Feiger. That is not an accurate statement of the law, and I feel like, especially since Mr. Chalmers objected, we need to clarify that the standard is deliberate indifference, and it's not just a general obligation to take care of all the health needs of the prisoners.
Thank you, Your Honor. Jailers stand in the position, this is just common knowledge, in loco parentis. The people in jail are totally helpless. They cannot feed themselves unless the jailers give them food. They cannot drink unless the jailers give them water. They can't leave the cell, and they can't get medical care unless the jailers get them medical care. They are totally helpless, just like a baby would be with a parent, just like truly an animal would be. And I don't want to make, we're human beings. But if a sick dog was sick, just like that, they are totally helpless, and the jailers have the absolute responsibility under the law to care
Counsel,
for
that
them.
is not an accurate statement of the law, and if you do that again, I'm going to have to stop your opening statement and give a full instruction to the jury about what the correct statement and the correct standard is.
The jury, thank you, Your Honor. The jailers cannot inflict cruel and inhuman treatment to anyone in the jail. And so the law has come up with a method by which we assess that. just to make it clear. In this case, there are only two issues, and one of them has already been decided. Was there a serious medical need? Did Mr. Bruner have a serious medical need under the Constitution of the United States? And the defendants admit he did. I'm about to explain that to you. They admit it. And the judge will explain to you the effect of that admission. The only thing then that's at issue in this case is a term of art that the law uses. Were the defendants deliberately indifferent? Deliberately indifferent. Indifferent means indifferent to a serious medical need, which they admit he had. I think I'm said it the right way. And they have an obligation to care for him and not be deliberately indifferent. Mr. Bruner was transferred from Sedgwick to Staton in November of 2008. And Mr. Bruner was kept at Staton for the months of November 2007, December 2007, all the way through to March of 2008. In 2008, in March, Mr. Bruner got sick. And what did he get sick from? And what will you hear the evidence in this case? He got sick from a bacteria called strep pneumonia. Strep pneumonia is a very, very common bug. And it doesn't cause pneumonia unless it's not treated. We've all heard of strep throat. It's treated, it's a bacteria, and it's treated with antibiotics. And if you, Z-Pak, literally, I take them, you've probably seen them. They're antibiotics, doctor gives them to you, clears up strep bacteria. It's the treatment of choice. There's even stronger antibiotics. Well, he was in Staton, and he got sick. And he was clearly very ill. Well, Staton suddenly didn't want him anymore. Now, you can use your own common sense in this case about why they didn't want him anymore. He didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't a bad prisoner for drunk driving. He just got sick. And so Staton, you'll hear, calls up Sedgwick and says, Mr. Bruner is real sick. We need to send him back to you, and you get him medical care. He needs it right away. In fact, I think they say he needs it immediately. And Sedgwick says, well, okay, we'll do it when we get around to it. Well, they didn't send anybody out to get him on the 5th of March. But about the 6th of March, about late in the afternoon, they sent some deputies out to pick him up. Now, if you get strep, and especially if you're susceptible, if you're immunocompromised, all you need is an antibiotic. It's the easiest thing in the world to get. That's the treatment of choice, an antibiotic. If you don't get an antibiotic and you let the disease progress, here's what happens. You develop strep pneumonia. Your lungs start filling up with fluid. If you don't get antibiotic, then the bacteria starts multiplying and taking over the red blood cells. The white blood cells multiply into the tens of thousands. I think at the time of his death, his white blood cell count was 34,000. At some point, if you don't get antibiotic, develops pneumonia, and then you develop a worse disease called sepsis, which is blood poisoning from the bacteria in your blood taking over your body. And then, if you still don't get an antibiotic, from that, it goes from pneumonia to sepsis to meningitis. Meningitis is the uncontrolled infection inflames the lining of the brain, which are a soft tissues called the meninges. And it inflames the brain. And if you don't get treatment for that, the brain literally swells up against your cranium, your skull. And if you don't get treatment for that, it'll swell up so much that it'll push the brain down your brain stem, and you'll stop breathing and die. And that's what happened to Terry Bruner, because he was brought back from Staton on the 6th of March, late in the afternoon. And he was put into, for an unknown reason, he wasn't taken to the clinic, he wasn't taken to the hospital, he wasn't seen by any doctor whatsoever, and he wasn't a risk of anything. He was put into maximum security for nobody knows why. They don't know why. You'll hear the testimony. Why is he put into maximum security? The hole, the pod 1 it's called, maximum security. He had done nothing. He needed to go. There actually is a portion of the jail called Ad Seg, where people get regular daily medical treatment. No, what's the reason for this? We don't know. We don't know. He was put into room 124 and locked in there on the 6th until he died on the 12th. Excuse me. He was let out because he became comatose on the 10th, later in the day, and they finally transported him to the hospital. He was essentially brain dead. You'll hear Dr. Haldeman, who is from Newton, he was at Via Christi, talk about when he was brought in, but he was essentially brain dead. They kept Terry Bruner alive for a day and a half. But between the 6th of March and late in the afternoon on the 10th, they locked him in a cell. No doctor saw him, no nurse saw him, and he was deathly ill. It's not as if they didn't know what was going on. This case is, they say, by the way, they say this case is, they say, we didn't know, so please let us go. They say, we didn't know, so please let us go. There is absolutely, you'll hear the evidence in this case, no way they didn't know. He is in a cell with a big window on it, with jailers, such as the defendants, looking at him. He is laying there. He is deathly ill. He is vomiting. He is moaning. He is coughing. He is not eating for the entire time he is in Sedgwick. Not a bit to eat, and they knew it. He is not drinking. He is not bathing. And the people who are there, the people who are housed in the jail, the other people, are telling the guards, he's sick, help him, help him, help him, because they're helpless too. And the reaction of these guards is, he's faking it. Let us alone. There's nothing wrong with him. He's walking around. It begins, at least it's documented, on the 9th of March. He starts walking around in an obtunded way. That means that he doesn't know what's going on. The brain has started to become infected by the sepsis and the swelling. It's documented in all the guards' records, and all they do is sit there and watch. They sit there and watch, and they talk to one another, and they claim they know nothing, absolutely nothing, even though Each individual person has seen something. Not one of them calls a doctor. Not one of them gets some help. It takes us up to the day of March the 10th, where these two jailers, Jameson and Staton, are on duty. At this point, if he doesn't get help within hours, if he doesn't get antibiotics, he's going to die. He's laying there. He's vomiting. He's unable to follow directions. First on the scene is jailer Staton. She sees him walking around aimlessly in front of his cell. On that day, for the first time he's there, he's been there for 5 days, they give him sheets.
Counsel, you have 3 minutes.
Well, I started at 25 after, Your Honor. So I think that takes me to when? Okay. They give him sheets. He stands there. He doesn't go get his sheets. He just starts walking aimlessly around. A little later on, he's found unconscious in his cell, curled up into a fetal position, in vomit. And these jailers, Jameson and Staton, just lift him up and have him lifted up. Ms. Staton didn't lift him up herself. Jameson did. And had him put onto his cot and then lock the door. Finally, at 3 o'clock, or about 3:45, if you believe the records in this case, 2 people come in. They're called by the jailers and they say, well, he's mentally ill. And they come in and look at him. He's having what's called contractures now. His body is moving up into a fetal position. They immediately look at him and say, oh my gosh, this is an emergency. And they immediately transport him to the clinic. Now, let me tell you, each one of these jailers has an absolute ability to call 911 and get him to a hospital at any time, at any moment. They are permitted to do it. So that you fully understand. Here is what a normal brain looks like. Here is Mr. Bruner's brain. That's, you will hear, the worst case of meningitis. It separated the brain apart and herniated. And he died a slow death. While these 2 jailers literally watched. They could not know. He was as sick as a human being can be. And so, because I have 1 more minute, the only issue in this case, at the end of the day, because you're going to hear a lot more evidence, he was so incredibly sick, this isn't a surprise. You will hear the evidence of how sick he was every single day, and these jailers didn't do a thing for him. The only thing that we have to decide is whether they violated the United States Constitution, Amendment 8, against cruel and inhuman punishment, by their deliberate indifference to an admitted serious medical need. That's this case, ladies and gentlemen. And again, the defense is, they say we didn't know, so
Counsel, your time is up.
Thank you very much, Ron. I promise I'll prove this case to you. Thank you very much.
got here this morning, I think it was a little bit before 9, to make sure that the slide projection would work. I had a technical guy here, and as happens, it won't. So you'll end up seeing pictures later, and I'll have to tell you what the evidence is right now. The claim in this case is about cruel and unusual punishment. It is a constitutional claim. And that means deliberately indifferent to providing needing care for a serious medical condition. And ultimately, it's hard for me to sit over there. Ultimately, you're going to hear the testimony, and what you're going to find is that this is a case about two deputies who, with the best of intentions, drew the wrong answers.
Mr. Chalmers, I don't mean to interrupt you, but if you want the video, I think it's just a question of us turning on a button up here.
Oh, that'd be great. Apparently not.
All right, well, talk to us tomorrow then. I'm sorry to interrupt.
All the instructions this morning is just not coming up. That's all right. Stuff happens.
Okay.
It is about two deputies who, with the best of intentions, did something wrong. You see, they didn't understand that Mr. Bruner had a need to see a doctor right away. There is a stipulation the parties entered into. It's agreed, and it was entered into to try to streamline the facts of the evidence and get down to what the case was about. And it was that Terry Bruner had been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver and hepatitis C from at least February 9, 2006. He was seen, you'll see medical records, frankly, almost years before he died. On March 5, 2008, his liver disease had progressed where he had compromised immune system, which made him susceptible to what killed him, which was the streptococcal pneumonia, sepsis pneumonia, meningitis. On the morning of March 10, 2008, 7 in the morning, Terry Bruner was suffering from an illness, and it's agreed, that led to his death. Now, we don't know whether he had the streptococcal pneumonia, the sepsis, the pneumonia, the meningitis at that time, but we know that he had a serious medical condition. And we know that he died of that serious medical condition, the streptococcal pneumonia, sepsis, pneumonia, and meningitis. So let's get by that. What's the case about? Well, it's about these two deputies. It's not about Sedgwick County. It's not about Staton County. It's not about the clinic, what they did or didn't do. It's about these two folks. It's about Mary Staton, who's a mom. At the time, she had a couple of teenage kids. Now, one's a little bit older. She's a Girl Scout leader, has been for years, and she worked at the jail. She got out of the military, found a guy, and lives in Wichita after that, and has been in the jailer practice for a long time. It's about Marque Jameson. He, frankly, at this time, hadn't been out in the job world that long. He just graduated from high school not too many years before. He's a local kid, was involved in athletics, he now is, he's not married, he lives with a woman. They have a committed relationship. He has a young kid that lives with him. And it's about what they knew and, more accurately, what they didn't know. Now, at the jail, there are a series of pods, and the jailers will be assigned a different pod. They don't, probably for security reasons, they're not always in the same pod. And in that pod, what you'll find is that this is pod 1. There are several different pods. There's one deputy that is assigned to that pod to watch the inmates. There are about 39 inmates on March 10. And the deputy sits in a booth in the middle of the pod, a glassed-in booth. This is a maximum security pod. Part of it is called, over in this section, Section B, That's where they put the people that are really bad, and they're in the detention. They don't get to come out of their cells except for one time a day. Then you've got people in Section A. Those are the people that are separated. They may be sexual molest type. They may be people like a former officer or something like that that's now in jail and needs to be separated for their own protection. Then you've got Section C. And stacked on top is a mezzanine area, so there's two floors to it. And Terry Bruner's cell was the cell number 24. Now, when Mary Staton got there, she's first shift. It's about 7 in the morning. And what she sees at 7 in the morning is just all the inmates in the cell. And she starts about her day. And her day includes letting inmates out of their cell and back in the cell. And she does that all remotely from this booth. There's a picture of the inside of the booth looking out, looking across to where the cells are. You see there's a cell door. You see the cell door has a window, and you can see from the booth you can't see into the cell door window. So how is it then that the jailers check on inmates? Well, they have to have a rover come in, someone to help them. And that person will come in and check on the inmates when the inmates don't come out into the day room. Or they the rover sometimes does a check, or they do a check themselves. And so you have, in this case, Mr. Jameson. His job was as a rover. And what he would do is he would come into this pod. He had other pods that he had to attend to, and he would handle those with the deputies. And he would check on the inmates as it was appropriate, or do whatever the pod deputy wanted him to do. Now, you don't know, as a pod deputy, the medical history about these inmates. You can't know it. HIPAA doesn't allow you to know it. You don't know when he got back, or why he's back, or this whole history that Mr. Feiger told you about, and supposedly how he's sick. What you know is what you see. What you know is what you're told that day. So what did they see and what were they told? Well, there is a daily activity log, and you're not really going to be able to see it from here, but I'll give you a flavor of it. And what happens is the jailer in pod sits there with the computer and makes entries. And the entries show that day at times those things that the deputies did. Then the deputies, after this, after they learned that Mr. Bruner had to go to the hospital, were asked to write reports, and they wrote reports. So you've got these daily activity logs, and you've got the reports, and you have an idea of what the deputies were doing. And what you'll find is at 7 in the morning, or roughly 7 in the morning, is when there's linen exchange every Monday. And every inmate is supposed to come out of their cell. The deputy in the booth remotely activates a door, opens that up. They go from their cell, they go to a gym area, and they swap out their linen. So Mr. Bruner had the opportunity to come out and get new linen at that time. You don't send all the inmates at one time. You send them in shifts, and that means you've got the person in the pod operating the buttons, letting people in and out. There's an intercom system that she uses to decide which one to come in, which one to come out. And at about 7 in the morning, a little bit after that, Mr. Bruner comes out, and he's walking slow. He's walking in a disoriented fashion, and he doesn't take his clothing to the gym for the exchange. So Mary Staton, she contacts two people, Mr. Jameson and Mr. Murphy, said, come in and put him back in his cell, because he doesn't seem to be responding. They come in and they say, look, this guy looks like, unfortunately, so many other inmates we see in there. He looks like a guy who's off his medication. He's got some sort of mental health issue. He may have too much of a dosage, too little of a dosage. No broken bones, no sweating, no vomiting, no coughing, no problem like that. Doesn't look sick, just isn't with it. And so they say, they take him back, put him in his cell. They report this to Staton. Staton, shortly after that, an inmate comes up and said, look, he hadn't been eating. So at around 10:30-ish, a little bit before that, when Staton's sergeant comes in doing his rounds, she tells him about this. And the sergeant says, well, okay, you think it's a mental health deal. Call mental health with the clinic. Have them come look at him. She does. And they say, okay, we'll come down during our normal rounds, which will be that afternoon. It's going to be a few hours later. Well, there's this issue about him not eating, so they also think, well, what we'll do, and you'll see that this is all in the logs. They say, well, let's monitor him, seeing whether or not he eats his meals. Frequently, inmates do not eat the chow that's provided. They can get commissary items. Maybe they decide to sleep in. They don't eat breakfast, but they wanted to monitor to see whether he's eating. He doesn't eat his meal, and Mary Staton puts on her log, doesn't eat meal. They're waiting for mental health to come down, still thinking that this is a mental health issue. At about 2 o'clock, an inmate says, look, he's not in his cell, he's not moving. Now, Mary Staton can't see him. He's laying down in his cell, not to be seen. There's nobody that's gone in during that time frame that's done a check. They can only do that a couple times a day. And so, with that information that he's laying on the cell floor, she calls Mr. Jameson again and says, come in and do a wellness check, see what's going on. He comes in, looks at him, finds him laying on the ground, no vomit, picks him up or helps pick him up, put him on the bed. He goes back to Mary Staton, says, Mary, he's not doing very well, or words to that effect. He's not responding. Again, he doesn't appear to be really sick. He looks like somebody who's got a bad case of the flu. He looks like someone who's not on his medications. That's what these folks thought. But by 2 o'clock, he's on the floor, and that by itself isn't an odd thing, because frequently inmates lay on the floor. Now, why do they do that? Well, maybe because it's the lights in the day room that keep them from sleeping. Maybe it's more comfortable on the floor. But all this wasn't all that unusual to them, unfortunately. That's normal behavior for many inmates. But they don't leave it there. Now, what they do is Mary picks up the phone, calls her sergeant, says, Sergeant, what's the deal? Her sergeant says, okay, I'll get with mental health. He gets with mental health. Mental health gets out there sometime before 3 o'clock. So there's a window of time between about 2:15 and 3 before they come out. He's able to round them up and get them during their rounds, give them some paperwork. That is the Sergeant Martinez who will come in and testify. And the mental health sees them. And mental health says, well, this looks like something that needs to be looked at by the clinic. So they take him up to the medical people. They have to put him in a wheelchair because they're not certain that he's going to be able to walk properly. At this point, he's starting to look worse for folks, and I think by the time they get the wheelchair, there is going to be some record that there's vomit on the ground. He's progressing and he's worse. They get him to the clinic, and now they've got the trained medical professionals there, and they're looking at him. He gets there somewhere around 3:30. It's about 3:25, 3:30. The exact records are here. And they look at him, and they evaluate him, and they run tests, and they don't decide that he needs to go to the hospital, the trained professionals, until around 9:30 that night. They get him to the hospital, and unfortunately, his condition has progressed where he doesn't survive. How's that possible? Dr. Petrie will come in, he's an expert, and he'll testify, and he'll explain that the symptoms of meningitis, the symptoms of those things that killed this man, they look a lot like someone who's got a cold or the flu. They look like someone who is just kind of confused. They're subtle. They don't ring out. They don't appear so obvious that you would know that this is an emergency situation. And it didn't appear this way to these two folks. Now, the questions I think you're going to have to ask after you hear the evidence is, what motive did these folks have for ignoring him? Wasn't this just an innocent mistake? Well, now you've heard suggestion it has something to do with money, and if we get into that, you'll find that the jail spends millions of dollars every year with ConMed. It's a contracted organization. It's there to provide inmates care, and it costs nothing more if there are 10 inmates or 100 or 100,000 visits that year. The inmates are to be provided for at the jail. Didn't make any difference to Mary Staton, didn't make any difference to Marque, Jameson, whether they be seen. You'll also find out that if you have an inmate, they've got lots of access to medical care. In fact, in this instance, what Mr. Bruner could have done at any time he was in that cell, and you'll see it in the photographs, he could have buzzed in, buzzed out, come out of his cell, and picked up a phone that was there with an available number to call if you've got an issue, you don't like you're being treated in the jail, or call a family member and say, I've got a problem. He could have called and talked to Mary Staton on the intercom in his cell and said, look, I need help, but he didn't. He could have written a formal request called a kite. He could have signed up for sick leave. He didn't. What we know is when he was in Staton County, where they saw him and they thought that he looked a little sick, they asked him, do you want to go to a hospital? And he said, no. He says, I just have the flu. I don't want to go. Now, when you also evaluate the evidence, besides considering the issue of what their motive is, look at, and I suggest, there are other things you can look at. This is just my suggestions. They're not gospel. You analyze it however you think is appropriate. Look at if what they were doing that's actually documented is consistent with deliberate indifference. Why do you fill out the logs the way you filled them out? Why do you call Jameson in to take a look at him? Why do you contact mental health? Why have mental health come? Why do anything if you're deliberately indifferent? Ultimately, and this is a very, very important case, the judge pointed that out. It's a very important case to these folks. Ultimately, if the evidence is, as I've told you, it will be, and it will, then we'll be asking for a defendant's verdict. Thank you, folks.
Members of the jury, we are going to take our recess here for the evening. Before I do, I want you to go with Ms. Haig to the jury room so that she can show you basically where we think you should have your headquarters be for the rest of the week. It's very common during the course of a trial for witnesses and lawyers and people who are associated with the parties to be in the courthouse, in the parking lots, you know, in the restaurants close by the courthouse and so forth. If it's really important that you not have any communications with any of these people, and even though your communications, I'm sure, would be entirely innocent, it can create an appearance of an impropriety, and that's something we want to avoid. So I think for the rest of the trial, if you use the jury room as your headquarters and base of operations, that will keep you out of harm's way. These jury rooms are certainly not luxurious in any way, but I think you'll find that they have the necessary creature comforts, restrooms and coffee pots, and you are more than free to bring in food, and that's sort of a corollary of jury practice, is bringing in food to share with the other members of the jury. So is there anything else we need to take up before we recess for the evening, counsel?
No, Your Honor.
Then if you all would go with Ms. Haig, we will stand in recess. We'll start court again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Court's in recess.
All rise.